Ruinas for this talk organized Center for French Francophone and Comparative Studies. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sergio Meijide Casas, who has a PhD in art history from the University of Santiago de Compostela, and also has a degree in philosophy from the UNED, right? From the Universidad Nacional de Educación a Distancia, and an MA in comparative literature, art and thought from the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. He's also a lecturer at the University of Santiago de Compostela. Sergio's research interests are in art theory and aesthetics. His PhD dissertation focuses on Jean-François Lyotard and the connection of his philosophy to art in the 1970s, and he has already published different things on Lyotard, on something that might be connected to things that he will be telling us about today, the influence of Lyotard's thought in Spain, but also he's prepared a critical edition of interviews by Lyotard connected to an exhibition, Les Immatérieux. And I also think that you're preparing a monograph on Lyotard. He's also co-edited a couple of books, one on landscape and another one on self-managed art. And he is currently a recipient of a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship from the Galician autonomous government in Spain to work on the project The Impact of French Theory in the Arts, Literature and Thought during the Spanish transition to democracy. And this is in fact what brings him to us. As part of that fellowship, he is staying with us at Birkbeck during an academic year, working with me on this project, and next academic year, he will be at the Sorbonne in Paris to complete those 2 years. So naturally, he's going to be telling us about this new work in progress. And as you can see on the screen, the title is The Uses of Lacanianism During the Spanish Transition to Democracy. Sergio, welcome. We look forward to listening to your talk. Sergio tells me he's going to be talking for around 45 or 50 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. We have the room until 3:30. Over to you.
I think we'll be there because there's a presentation and maybe I can... Okay, as my path said, this is a work in progress, so maybe some of the classifications or the proposals that I will make or the hypotheses are not very well or very clear or a bit diffuse, but I think this is part of the process, and your questions and your comments will help me to continue my research. So, although it may initially seem strange to discuss the potential significance of the renowned French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan in Spain's transition to democracy during the 1970s, psychoanalysis has undoubtedly had a substantial impact on the country's political and cultural landscape. Over the last 15 years, post-Lacanian concepts such as floating signifier or hegemony have become part of our everyday political vocabulary in Spain, as they were regularly used by some of the main political representatives of left-wing parties such as Podemos, Más Madrid, Más País, and Sumar, many of whom emerged from the political science departments of some universities in Madrid, notably the Universidad Complutense. In this regard, it is interesting to point out that the Podemos party, the main representative of the alternative left born in the wake of the 15M movement, held a special assembly forum dedicated to Lacanian psychoanalysis. My hypothesis is that this is not an historical coincidence, but rather that the use of this vocabulary originated in the 1970s during the Spanish transition to democracy. At that time, Lacanian psychoanalysis served as a meeting point between different theoretical positions that were unable to articulate the leap between the individual and the society. Of course, Lacan is not the only element in the equation, and this phenomenon is not exclusive to Spain. The events of May 1968, the rise of structuralism and post-structuralism, the anti-psychiatry movement and queer activism were all interconnected developments that emerged and evolved in many countries during the 1970s. However, in all these countries, these processes gave rise to different debates and political, artistic, or literary movements. The story I'm going to tell is particularly significant in Spain because it coincided with the end of a 40-year dictatorship and a time when society as a whole was willing to imagine new possibilities, but also because of Spain's own relationship with psychiatry and psychoanalysis. During the Republican period, as Maripaz well knows, the Instituto Peramata in Reus became the epicenter of therapeutic models such as Psiquiatría de Extensión, extension psychiatry, the precursor to the institutional psychotherapy that Francesc Tosquelles would popularize in France. This new therapeutic approach faced the isolation of patients who were treated as mad, seeking to involve them in everyday life through support networks. However, after the Civil War, Franco's regime exiled many of these psychiatrists, resulting in much of the theoretical debate continuing outside Spain. Meanwhile, figures such as the infamous Antonio Vallejo Nájera, who defended the genetic inferiority of communists, took control of the psychiatric system throughout the country. In this context, humanistic approaches such as psychoanalysis were banned and partially censored. Certainly, not everyone in Franco's psychiatric apparatus was so incompetent. Once Vallejo Nájera died in 1960, and despite the fact that his legacy was continued by some of his disciples, including his son Juan Antonio Vallejo Nájera, hegemony became divided between Juan José López Ibor in Madrid and Ramón Sarró in Barcelona, two well-traveled individuals with a deep knowledge of psychoanalysis and philosophy. The former, a Catholic associated with the Falange, the fascist party in Spain, or the fascist core part of the Franquist dictatorship, had conducted research at several centers across Europe, while the latter had met Freud in person and was said to be one of his disciples. This did not prevent them from participating in some of the common practices of psychiatry at that time, including lobotomies, electroshock therapy, conversion therapy for homosexuals, and from 1952 onwards, the use of some of the drugs that ushered in the new era of psychiatry, such as antipsychotics and antidepressants. It was the use of these biopolitical tools that defined the scientific approach that would be common during the Franco regime, and under which they gradually ceased to engage with advances in other disciplines such as sociology or linguistics, confirming a separation that cannot be reduced solely to that between psychiatry in exile and psychiatry in Spain, but must also be understood as a separation between scientific knowledge and humanistic knowledge, or between the treatment of the individual patient and the patient situated in a social context. It was the psychiatrists of the late Franco era and the transition who healed this rift, restoring the cross-disciplinary nature inherent to psychiatry and psychology. Of course, if certain ideas and practices could re-emerge in the 1970s, if certain debates that had already taken place in the 1930s could be revisited in the psychiatric and anti-psychiatric practices of the 1970s, it was because there were different theories operating openly or covertly within the state itself. Although it is difficult to organize, I provisionally propose this categorization in three different trends. Firstly, there was humanistic psychoanalysis, a tradition dating back to pre-Civil War psychiatry that served as a counterpoint to Frankist psychiatry in the 50s and the 60s. As is well documented, Freud was censored during the early years of Franco's regime because his ideas conflicted with Catholicism. However, its use gradually became more permissive, as many of the Frankist psychiatrists had been trained during the Republic when Freud was a key part of the required bibliography, so his ideas could not easily be removed from their medical approach. Along with Freud, others who escaped the purge were Karl Jaspers and Erich Fromm, whose ideas were very attractive to the few progressive psychiatrists seeking a different way of thinking about problems. Among them were, for example, the renowned novelist and psychiatrist Luis Martín Santos, author of Tiempo de Silencio, who was working on a kind of existential psychoanalysis when he died prematurely in 1964. He left his editor with what would become his main theoretical legacy, Libertad, Temporalidad y Transferencia en el Psicoanálisis Existencial, Freedom, Temporality and Transference in Existential Psychoanalysis. There was also Carlos Castilla del Pino, probably the most erudite psychiatrist of his generation, who was trained by Franco's orthodox regime under Juan José Ibor, but his communist ideas led to his marginalization and prevented him from obtaining a university chair until the Socialist Party came to power after the transition to democracy in the 1980s. His most notable publications from this period include Un estudio sobre la depresión, 1966, Un humanismo imposible, 1968, and Psychoanalysis and Marxism, Psychoanalysis y Marxismo, 1969. Finally, Nicolas Caparrós, whose approach was less existentialist than that of the previous two and was in line with Georges Politzer's Marxist humanism. His goal was to integrate psychoanalysis into Marxist theory. He believed that therapy's political contribution lay in its work with patients. Perhaps transforming individual psychology could lead patients to become critical subjects capable of transforming society when they reintegrate into it. For Caparrós, the central element of psychoanalysis was self-questioning rather than the physical, biological laws operating behind the unconscious. This idea is reflected in his book, Psicología de la Liberación, 1975, which he wrote with his cousin Antonio Caparrós. Although in different ways, these three authors, Martín Santos, Castilla del Pino, and Caparrós, share a deep interest in reconciling Marxism and psychoanalysis, bearing in mind that they are not the same thing and that each must operate within its own sphere. Marxism is devoted to analyzing society made up of subjects, while psychoanalysis is devoted to analyzing the subject in society. As Castilla del Pino puts it, the goal of psychoanalysis is the de-alienation of self-consciousness through the de-alienation of social consciousness. The second theoretical position that gained strength internationally during those years was based on what we might call Freudian energeticism. While psychanalysts, psychiatrists, and humanistic therapists argue that psychoanalytic therapy's great contribution lay in its ability to encourage self-reflection, this other school of thought considered that what was interesting about Freud was his proposal of a general libidinal economy led by the pleasure principle and the reality principle, later by the life and death drives, as a kind of polarity that could explain reality beyond the limits of the subject itself. While psychoanalysis, when used in clinical therapy, could only explain the genesis of the patient's subjectivity, this general libidinal economy, influenced by thermodynamics, could explain the whole of social interactions, for some, even the whole of cosmic interactions. This theory would have a huge impact in France and Germany, as its ontological nature meant that Freud could be regarded as a first-rate philosopher capable of producing valuable tools beyond the realm of therapy. Some of the thinkers who followed this line of thought, albeit in different ways, very different ways, were Wilhelm Reich, Georges Bataille, Herbert Marcuse, Pierre Klossowski, Gilles Deleuze, Jean-François Lyotard, and of course Jacques Lacan, whose ideas would connect both fields, as would also happen with his wayward disciple Félix Guattari. The clinic of humanistic psychoanalysis and the social analysis of energeticist psychoanalysis. In other words, unlike the humanistic approach, which considered Marxism and Freudianism to be compatible but distinct, the energeticists, sometimes called Freudo-Marxists, although this term is imprecise, advocated an integrated use of both. This turned the social into a field that could be approached from a psychoanalytic perspective, and the subject and subjectivity into problems relating also to Marxist theories. Although Freud's energetic and ontological interpretation developed at the same time as the humanistic interpretation of his work, which was highly skeptical of some of his later concepts, such as the death drive, it did not enjoy much prestige in Spain. This was largely because Reich, its main advocate at that time, fell into disrepute after developing the theory of orgone, a metaphysical philosophy that turned out to be a scam. He was arrested for marketing orgone accumulators himself. It was not until the late 1960s that Marcuse's theories began to gain ground and Reich's image began to improve thanks to the contributions of Carlos Frigola and some editions published by Ramón García for Anagrama Publishing House. These two psychoanalytic positions were based on a fundamental difference, although this was always relative and nuanced depending on who was expressing it. For humanists, mostly psychiatrists, illness existed as something partially independent of the social structure. Patients had to receive treatment in order to be cured. For the energeticists, the subject was an expression of a series of trans-individual principles, and consequently, illness was the result of the capitalist social structure. We are all sick and there is no possible cure. The best possible therapy is the end of capitalism. The reconciliation of certain aspects of these two theories gave rise to a third position that was internationally popular in the 1970s. Anti-psychiatry. This combined the medical and humanistic dimension of the former, addressing the problems of the individual, since they were psychiatrists, with the consideration of mental illness as a disease produced within society, as advocated by the latter. Studies on schizophrenia and its relationship with social and family environments became renowned in this regard. The term anti-psychiatry is confusing for several reasons, as it encompasses a wide range of similar yet very different perspectives. The ideas and practices of phenomenologists and followers of Sartre, such as David Cooper and Ronald David Lang, are not the same as those of Franco Basaglia, a pragmatic psychiatrist whose theoretical discourse was always at the service of political praxis. In fact, he deeply distrusted any kind of psychoanalysis or theoretical proposal of that nature. For example, it is common to say that anti-psychiatry is directed against all psychiatric institutions, with the ultimate goal being a utopia in which patients would not be treated because there would be nothing to treat. Glaze stated this in a text that had a certain influence in Spain called El contenido conservador de la antipsiquiatría, the conservative content of antipsychiatry. Nevertheless, many so-called antipsychiatrists were more reformist than is commonly believed. They did not argue that patients should not be treated simply because they believed that illness had a social origin or that we are all ill. Basaglia, for example, even at his most radical, called for reasonable measures such as not admitting patients against their will. Meanwhile, Cooper developed a series of reflections in which he differentiated between the madness experienced by everyone and the acting outs that could conflict with the proper functioning of society, that is, the behaviors exhibited by potential patients. Leng did not even consider himself close to antipsychiatry, even thought he is considered to be its central figure. In this regard, I would argue that there was never an active stance against institutional psychiatry among anti-psychiatry sympathizers in Spain. Many humanist psychiatrists, such as Caparrós, who had trained with Cooper and Leng in London, returned to their workplaces as normal. Those close to antipsychiatry, such as Ramón García, also worked and collaborated at times with psychiatrists from the Franco regime, such as Ramón Sarró. So, in Spain, at least, psychiatry and antipsychiatry are not presented as opposing forces, but rather as two positions regarding the patient and society that coexist in the same working environment, feeding off each other productively. It was the advent of antipsychiatry and the gradual recovery of Reich's energeticist positions, coupled with the reception of structuralism in the late 1960s, that sparked an interest in Lacan among psychiatrists. Therefore, it was not a violent and disruptive entry of a new theory, but rather a progressive transformation of the paradigm that owed much to generational change. In this context, the only people who opposed the psychiatry institution were sociologists who were disciples of Foucault and Bourdieu, such as Julia Varela and Fernando Álvarez Uria. They questioned clinical practices as well as the divan as an extension of these practices. However, they did so from a distance, as their dedication was to sociology or philosophy rather than psychiatry. Now that we have the context, the main trends operating at that time, we can move on to the main topic. As far as we know, Lacan visited Spain on at least 2 occasions before Franco's death in 1975, and both times he went to Barcelona. The first was for the International Congress of Psychotherapy held in the city in September 1958, where he presented the lecture La psychanalyse vraie et la fausse. And the second was for the inauguration of the 1972-1973 academic year of the Catalan Association of Psychiatry. However, the fact that he was physically in Barcelona on those 2 occasions in the late 50s and the early 1970s does not mean that his ideas arrived with him. It is almost certain that in the first case no one or hardly anyone noticed him, as his fame was solely due to a celebrated doctoral thesis in psychiatry that had received only good reviews in specialist circles. It is known that his thesis was widely read at the Instituto Peramata in Reus, where Emily Mira, Francesc Tosquellas, and also Josep Solanas were based. But almost all of them were in exile, and Lacan himself had made a significant shift in his career by entering the world of psychoanalysis. Otherwise, it was a massive event attended by some of the great figures of psychiatry, such as Minkowski, and Lacan's text was not even published in the proceedings, so it is reasonable to assume that it had no impact. On his second trip, however, he was already a figure of great international renown, and it is possible that his arrival aroused a certain interest in wider circles. Even so, it is also fair to say that few people at that time had the necessary knowledge to understand the complex Lacanian language, an extremely specific conceptual vocabulary that had to be mastered in order to understand any of his public interventions. The conclusion is that despite Lacan's 2 visits to Spain, his impact was practically invisible. There was a strong desire to understand Lacan, who was already considered important, but it was a very difficult task. Eugenio Trias, one of the most important philosophers of those years, if not the most important in Spain, acknowledged that the absence of translations of Lacan into Spanish made it impossible for him to incorporate and debate his ideas, even thought his French was quite good, and he did not have any problem reading and discussing the theories of Claude Lévi-Strauss or Michel Foucault very early on. It was with the arrival of the Argentinian Oscar Masotta in Barcelona that Lacanianism truly began to take hold in Spain. This is significant, as Lacanianism will not be brought by Lacan from France, but by Masotta from Buenos Aires. And perhaps this explains the close relationship between Lacanianism and left-wing politics in Spain, a relationship that in France was more limited to the Maoism of the 1960s, but which in Spain continues to the present day. Masotta was a very important figure in the cultural ecosystem of Buenos Aires in 1960s. He cannot be described as either an artist or a theorist, because he did a bit of both. He wrote books, but also starred in happenings. He was a dilettante who straddled several worlds, a countercultural figure who was active in Marxist circles, but wrote about pop art and was interested in psychoanalysis. Among many other things, he is considered the author of the first text on Lacan in the Spanish language, and also the main introducer of his work in Argentina, where he founded the Freudian School of Buenos Aires. In 1974, he moved to London, fleeing the imminent Videla dictatorship, and it was from here that he traveled to Barcelona. A small thing of the widespread and shared interest in understanding Lacan is that those who convinced Masotta to come to Barcelona were not psychoanalysts, but people linked to anti-psychiatry who were in London working with Cooper and Laing, notably Alicia Roche, who was very close to anti-psychiatry. When Masotta arrived in Barcelona, he continued to work the work he had been doing in Buenos Aires. He created a new Freudian school and started a new introductory seminar on Lacan, which was advertised through posters printed and hung in the streets, and which took place in different private apartments, such as the residence of the psychoanalyst Magda Bosch and her husband, the painter Guinobard. These sessions were attended by a large part of Barcelona's intellectual elite of the time: the philosopher Eugenio Trias, the anthropologist Alberto Cardín, the poet Biel Mesquida, the visual artist Pepe Spaliu, the then art theorist and now ultra-conservative journalist Federico Jiménez Los Santos, among many others. It was so successful that Masotta embarked on a tour of different parts of Spain, explaining the thinking of Freud and Lacan to anyone who was interested, helping to found Freudian libraries in other parts of Spain, such as Vigo. This lasted only 5 years. In 1980, he died prematurely of cancer. However, the impact had already been made. Lacanian vocabulary was now known and could be used for more than just clinical therapy, notably for art and politics. The most obvious consequence of Masotta's seminar is that some of those who attended them, already equipped with the necessary tools, translated texts that require an advanced knowledge of psychoanalysis, structuralism, and post-structuralism, such as Lyotard's Discourses, edited by Federico Jiménez dos Santos in 1979, and Deleuze's Difference and Repetition, translated by Alberto Cardin in 1988. These were no longer texts that arrived out of context through psychiatrists' interest in other methodologies, but systematic translations that included scholarly prologues and specific bibliographies. Alongside the translations, new magazines also appeared, such as Divan, Textos, Revista de Literatura, and Trama, which discussed structuralism and post-structuralism, experimental literature, and other issues related to politics and ontology. These magazines quickly gave way to more popular ones, such as Triunfo, Star, Ajo Blanco, and El Viejo Topo, which were not strictly devoted to theory, but rather to cultural and political current affairs, and which echoed these new theories and projected them to a wider spectrum of readers, dedicating monographic issues to anti-psychiatry. Here we can see an issue on anti-psychiatry from the magazine Ajo Blanco and one on Freudo-Marxism prepared by Alberto Cardin, Federico Jiménez dos Santos, and Alex S. Valero for Revista de Literatura, where the cover, designed by artist Gonzalo Tena, represented the complex relationship between Freud and Marx, embodied here by Greta Garbo and John Gilbert. Of course, this account on Lacan's arrival through Masotta in 1975 and the subsequent translation of post-Lacanian texts is not entirely accurate. The issue on Freudo-Marxism predates Masotta's arrival, even if it was produced by his future students. In fact, like this one, there were already a few scattered publications at that time. For example, the translation of some texts by Lacan and Althusser had begun in the psychiatry collection edited by Ramon Garcia for the Anagrama Publishing House, which had also published some works by Reich. I am referring specifically to the joint publication in 1970, 5 years before Masotta's arrival, of Althusser's text Freud y Lacan, 1964, and Lacan's text El objeto del psicoanálisis, a translation of the text Réponse à des étudiants en philosophie sur l'objet de la psychanalyse, 1966. However, two things should be noted about this publication. First, although both texts clearly highlight Lacan's singularities in relation to other psychoanalytic traditions, they fail to fully explain his thinking, serving instead to further whet the appetite for a real understanding. In other words, they could serve as a trailer or preview of Lacanianism rather than a useful explanation for newcomers. Secondly, that in line with the specificity attributed to Lacanianism, the ideas of these two thinkers, Lacan and Althusser, were not presented as something that could be combined with any of the pre-existing trends, humanist psychoanalysis, energetic psychoanalysis, or anti-psychiatry. What I mean by this is that Ramon Garcia's collection could include texts of different kinds, such as Althusser, Reich, Basaglia, or Noam Chomsky, but always as a separate books. This is a very remarkable editorial achievement, but one that perhaps did not provide readers with enough theoretical context to understand how each text fit into the psychoanalytic, political, or philosophical debate. In this sense, Masotta's arrival not only provides a real explanation of Lacan's thinking, accessible but sophisticated, that will also be accompanied by specific books dedicated to the subject, such as Ensayos Lacanianos, 1977, and Lecciones de Introducción al Psicoanálisis, 1982. Furthermore, himself began to combine these theories with others, as demonstrated in his translation of the book Locura y Sociedad Segregativa, Madness and Segregative Society, 1976, coordinated by Armando Verdiglione, which included text by Julia Kristeva, Philippe Soler, Jean Houry, and Félix Guattari. Thanks to publications such as this, psychoanalysis and anti-psychiatry cease to be opposing forces and become tools for the same end. The situation is the same with the confrontation between humanistic psychoanalysis and energeticism. This does not mean that critical psychiatrists of the 1950s and 1960s began to embrace Freudian energeticism thanks to Lacan. In fact, they will despise Lacan and all the Marxist theorists who incorporated Lacanianism into their assumptions, such as Louis Althusser and his disciples, Alain Badiou, Jacques Rancière, Etienne Balibar, Pierre Macheret, and so on. One example is Castilla del Pino, who will say until the end of his days that Lacan's ideas are pure charlatanería. This is a play on words between charlatanería, charlatanism, and Lacan, so charlatanería, charlatanism. This had to do not only with his obscure use of language, but also with Lacan's revival of the late Freud, something that aligned him with the energeticist psychoanalysts so detested by humanists, and led him to consider as a fundamental principle of his thinking that we are all mad, that there is no cure, and what was most difficult for the previous generation of therapists to accept, that there is no subject. Change does not happen retrospectively. It is a matter of a new generation willing to think differently and freely hybridize the legacy of Mira and Tosquella's psychotherapy, the humanism of Castilla del Pino and Martín Santos, the anti-psychiatry of Basaglia, Cooper, and Lang, and the post-Freudian energeticism of Reich through a new frame that makes them compatible, since accepting that illness such as schizophrenia, depression, or bipolar disorder have their origins in society or are socially reinforced does not mean denying psychiatric care. Lacan is one example, but he is not an isolated name. He represents a whole group of names and post-1968 theories that had an impact on Spanish culture at the same time as a political change as significant as the end of a 40-year dictatorship was taking place. Other names that are very appealing for thinking about these shifts could be those of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, whose Anti-Oedipus was translated in 1973, just 1 year after its original publication, and was a publishing success among artists of the time. We could also mention Michel Foucault, whose sphere of influence was mainly among young sociologists who sought to replicate his methods. However, beyond the general climate of the time, what specific impact can we draw from the arrival of Lacanianism? Firstly, Lacanianism was important for the homosexual community. Rudinesco recounts that in France it was not common to treat homosexual patients without pathologizing them for their condition. In Spain, of course, this was also the case. Psychiatrists such as López Ibor still boasted in the 1970s about lobotomizing homosexual patients, and even the much more modern Castilla del Pino performed conversion therapy. However, Lacan had no problem admitting patients of any sexual orientation to his practice, a striking characteristic that made him highly appreciated by the community. Jean Beaufret, who introduced Heidegger's work in France, is a paradigmatic example. By erasing the subject and accepting that the processes of subjectivation are inscribed in an unconscious traversed by the symbolic, Lacan did away with any pre-existing idea of the subject with which to compare the patient. It was no longer a question of seeing how the patient was maladjusted to an external reality that was hostile to him, but rather how all subjects created an image of the outside world for themselves. This new narrative on the genesis of subjectivity led, secondly, to renewed interest in writers and theorists who focused on the fragmented individual, such as Severo Sarduy, who was then attempting a reinterpretation of the Baroque from a queer perspective, and whose partner, François Val, was Lacan's editor and a member of Telquel. It also led to the development of literary theories that sought to understand the subject from the perspective of its multiplicity, always influenced by Roland Barthes, as demonstrated in the essay Schizosemia by Jordi Jovet, which won the Anagrama Essay Prize in 1978. And, of course, it was reflected in artistic practices. On the one hand, the so-called schizos of Madrid compulsively read Deleuze and Guattari Anti-Oedipus and began to understand the unconscious as a machine that produces subjectivity. On the other, in Barcelona, the painters of the Trauma group clung to the structuralist theories that Marcelin Plenet had articulated in the magazine Pinture, close to Telquel, in order to present an unconscious structure as a language that opposed the delusions of their Madrid counterparts. Through Lacan and Deleuze-Guattari, the philosophical and psychiatric debate shifted to the artistic and literary sphere, transforming many of the themes of reflection as well as the prevailing artistic codes. Thirdly, Lacanianism had an impact on the field of psychiatry itself. At the instigation of the Communist Party, which was fighting to be legalized and to be able to participate in the first democratic elections after the dictatorship, the Coordinadora Psiquiátrica, Psychiatric Coordination Committee, led by Ramón García, made up of young psychiatrists willing to combine anti-psychiatry, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and so on, was persuaded to cease its independent activity and present itself to the leadership of the Asociación Española de Neuropsiquiatría, Spanish Association of Neuropsychiatry. They succeed in 1977, forming the first progressive-minded board of directors that was also willing to adopt other theoretical frameworks. This became evident in their journal, Revista de la Asociación Española de Neuropsiquiatría, which began to feature specific sections and issues on Lacanian psychoanalysis, inviting philosophers such as Víctor Gómez Pin to make contributions that would have been unthinkable in the context of Franquist psychiatry and even humanist psychiatry. Finally, a fourth area of application of Lacanianism was public debate, which is perhaps the most diffuse aspect, but also one of the most interesting to analyze. In contrast to the existentialist discourse in the first person that had characterized many of the positions taken in the public sphere during the Franco regime, but also during the transition, Lacanians began to articulate another way of presenting the subjective voice in their press articles and theoretical texts. To give an example of this use, it is worth noting that most thinkers in the wake of Lacanianism, many of them homosexuals, for the reasons already explained, such as Alberto Cardin, had a certain disregard for the articulation of discourse typical of polemicists such as the philosopher Fernando Savater, who always spoke in the first person and did so vehemently and excessively. In contrast to this form of enunciation, typical of a strong subject who is very clear about what he thinks and what he wants to say, Lacanians popularized a type of coded language in which subjectivity was presented in an elliptical and complex way, self-aware of the impossibility of a closed subject. This position with regard to public discourse was not exclusive to the debates between post-existentialists such as Savater or Félix de Azúa and structuralist Lacanians such as Alberto Cardin, but permeated other instances of public debate and reached spaces of greater political and social scope, as seen in the early 90s in the text that the artist Pepe Espaliu published in the newspaper El País, in which he confessed to being homosexual and suffering from AIDS. Espaliu began the text with the profound phrase, "Para los que ya no viven en mí," for those who no longer live in me, and concluded as follows: AIDS has radically forced me to be there. It has precipitated me into its being as pure emergency. I am grateful to AIDS for this unthinkable return to the surface, placing me for the first time in an action in terms of reality. Perhaps this time, and I don't care if it is the last, my work as an artist has full meaning, an absolute union with an existential limit that I always hovered around without fully knowing it, dancing with it without ever embracing it. Today, I know the true dimension of that limit. Today, I have stopped imagining it. Today, I am that limit. It is no coincidence that Espaliu speaks in terms of reality and the limit. As I have already mentioned, he, the first public figure to declare himself ill with AIDS in Spain, also attended Masotta's seminar and was so impressed by Lacanian theories that he went to Paris to be able to follow Lacan's own seminars. This is not only relevant to his artistic work, which focuses on the ambiguity of identity and the subject, but also to his active participation in the political debates of his time, where he understood that the individual was political since the subject is nothing more than the result of a normalization that occurs before we come into the world. I could show other examples, but I think the idea is clear. It is not a question of saying that Lacanian theories change Spanish cultural life, bringing it out of the obscurantism of Franquism, but rather of understanding how these ideas are translated in Spain, reworked, and used as a tool with direct or indirect application in public life. The architect of all this was not Lacan, nor even Masotta, but all those who were driven to think differently about the problems of their time in order to contribute other possible solutions. Of course, the story is not that simple. Lacanians also developed an obscurantist and scholastic vocabulary that contradicted some of the social principles of Republican psychiatry. However, even with its shadows, which do exist, we can say that the introduction of Lacanianism was relevant to the transformation of subjectivity in Spain during the transition, removing pre-existing theoretical frameworks and, in some way, allowing for the recovery of part of the humanistic condition that had been overshadowed by scientism during the Franco regime, even if it did so through a paradigm that was no longer humanistic but maybe post-humanistic. And that's all. Thank you.
Very much. That was really illuminating, at least for me. We have half an hour or so for questions. Does anybody want to start?
Questions or reflections?
Apologies for my gas, just sort of shock, surprise, revelation earlier. I've worked in the past quite a lot on a Catalan writer, sculptor, artist, poet called Guillem Viladot, who's from Lleida, who knew Josep Guinovart obviously very well, but in all the time, as far as I'm aware, in all the time that I've looked at Viladot, including the sort of Lacanian ideas and language that permeate certainly his later work from about the mid-1970s onwards, I don't think I'd come across the name of Masotta, so I now need to go back. But certainly that relationship that Viladot had with Guinovart suggests that he would have been picking up those ideas, if not directly from the seminars, then probably from Guinovart. And just contextually, so much of what you've said has allowed me to make connections between why Viladot in particular found, I think, so much freedom, so much possibility in Lacan, in Lacanian psychoanalysis specifically, because I don't have a detailed grasp of the different schools, etc., of psychoanalysis, but what you said today has enabled me to fill quite a lot of gaps, and it's really got me thinking about things. So I just want to say that on a personal basis, thank you very much. It's been really, really enlightening.
Thank you. I don't know about this Guillem Viladot. So how's the, you know it, Viladot? How's
He's Viladot, and Guillem obviously. Birth dates are, I think, 1922 to 1999. In particular, in the kind of early mid-1970s, he starts. There is a much more explicit engagement with this use of sexuality, increasingly of gender identity as well. So again, we see the possibilities there. He ends up writing one of the earliest, I think, novels on a trans subject, which is published posthumously. Not obviously a work of trans experience, it's not first person, but via again the trans daughter of a very close artist friend of his, etc. So I don't know. I think we see a general kind of an evolution from the beginning of the 1970s through till the end of his life, which sees him become more radical within a relatively conservative context, I think, and I think that clearly Lacanian ideas help him to do that. So lots to think about.
Yeah. Thank you.
How do you think this? Perhaps this is a work in progress. How do you think your work allows us to think differently about the Spanish transition to democracy?
The main idea of my whole research is to understand these little pieces of theory and art and so on as example of or way to read the transition to democracy in libidinal terms, following, for example, the works of Germán Labrador, because I think that there is always a narrative about the transition to democracy that is very focused in some of the political changes from Frankism to democracy, and maybe there are subtle fluxes that go beyond, or that go in a more how to say it, that passes through different places and transform the energetic circulations of desire and subjectivity, and it is a thing that connects. I mean, I think that there is a thing that is very relevant in Spanish institutional democracy, that is that the change that came from the 1968 in the whole world in Spain is related also to the transition to democracy, because there is a fighting against Frankism in the late Frankism and the early democracy, and there are tools from the philosophical, artistic, literary theories related to the May of 1968 that help to transform the country in a completely different way, and this is not related to the political thing and the fightings between different political parties, but it's a transformation of the own subjectivities of people who want to imagine in a new way, to desire in a new way, to be himself, completely different. And I think all these theoretical references, but also the artistic context that surround these theoretical references, could help us to understand the transition to democracy as a transformation of the subjectivity, as a transformation of the libidinal scope of people who want to desire in a different way.
But Labrador, for example, makes that argument about the libidinal transition. And so the narrative there is, these people wanted radical political change, but they also wanted libidinal change. Yeah. But that narrative, the way that narrative goes is after, 76 and so, everything dies. Everything's completely co-opted, repressed, gone. Is that what you think your narrative is leading you?
No, I think that I agree with the first part, but not with the second part. Labradors say that when people die from, there are these two transitions, and one of the parts of the transition die, but I think that the transformations of the transition to democracy can be continued to our present, and I think that there is and this is why I start my presentation speaking of Podemos and all these parties that use Lacanian psychoanalysis and so on. I think there is a libidinal transformation that continue to be here, and that connects the transition to democracy to our present in Spain, and it's not only in terms of the freedom of people to do what they want, but also in terms of for example, the self-expressions of difference, as the transsexual or the homosexual. And I think that it's a change, and there is a libidinal change in Spain during those years, but it's not a change that die after the transition with the victory of the Partido Socialista or so on, but there is a subtle influence that come to our days, and that we can recover and so on. It is not only a theoretical approach, but maybe also a way to understand the politics of today also.
Good.
Yes, you mentioned Deleuze and Guattari and Lacan, they kind of the same, part of the same influence on Spanish. How I mean, how did people reconcile the fact that Lacan is a pure structuralist and Deleuze and Guattari are very much anti-structuralists? Their post-structuralism is also an anti-structuralism. And so basically they can't really be considered as kind of one thing.
Yeah. There were two answers to this question. The first one is that they won't reconcile anything because the Lacanians were in Barcelona and were structuralists and were at that time Maoists, and the Deleuze, Guattari followers were in Madrid and were anarchists and so on. And for example, the painters of the Madrid Movida Madrileña that were the named esquizos de Madrid, like esquizos, and they were named as esquizos by his enemies from Barcelona, the structuralists. So they are the esquizos and they don't know about politics, but we are Maoists and we will take the power. So this is the first answer. There is no reconciliation, but there is a second answer that I think it is more interesting, that there are some specific figures as Alberto Cardin that I think can mix Lacan and Deleuze Guattari, as Alberto Cardin was the translator of Diferencia Repetición, Difference and Repetition in Spain, but he was also one of the main examples of Lacanians at that time in the field of, he was anthropologist, but in the field of theory in general, and I think he made this connection through the seminar, the 20 seminar of Lacan, this Encore seminar, and this seminar, in this seminar Lacan, in my perspective, made a transformation from structuralism to post-structuralism through the concept of la langue. I mean, there is this idea of the unconscious that is structured as a linguistics, as a language, but in this seminar and from the 72 until the end of his days, I think there is a shift. Lacanians say that there is in Lacan like three stages, three periods: the period of the imaginary, the period of the symbolic, and the period of the real. And this period of the real, I think it could be understood as a post-structuralist Lacan that doesn't understand in the same way that unconscious is, as he didn't deny that unconscious is structured as a language, but he complexified this approach. And I think that for Alberto Cardin, the seminar Encore was the point to connect Deleuze Guattari and also Jacques Lacan. Yeah.
And it's very interesting to me that Lacan had such influence in the Latin America and also in this context, which I'm less familiar with, in terms of context of political transformation, revolution, because I think even though I think he's a post-structuralist, it's also a discourse which is very kind of hermetically tight. And it seems to me there are kind of three strands in what you're talking about, which may also apply to the Latin American context, which is this idea of Lacanianism as a kind of psychoanalytic concept, one which it also has a kind of energetic quality, which is quite different to its psychoanalytic application, and then its kind of deployment or its circulation, kind of political atmospheres. Now they seem to me to be all kind of distinct, but they're somehow kind of like free floating in this environment of revolution. Because I don't think there's anything as such in Lacanian theory or Lacanian psychoanalysis that believes in revolution as such, or that sort of wills it because it sort of assumes that's not really possible. It would just be a kind of reinstatement, of the master's discourse. And so I guess my question is then, is there something in this that's really about a kind of Lacanianism and psychoanalysis as a kind of energetic field, more so than as a kind of a diagnostic theory or even a political theory?
I don't know if I understand your question, if you can repeat.
There's something about the way I think in which psychoanalysis, and particularly I think Lacanianism, is mobilized, which feels to me often as being more effective in a kind of energetic sense, which does lend itself to, I mean, if you've ever been in a room of just Lacanians talking, it's a very kind of particular experience. Because as a discourse, it is very, very rich, it's very, very, it can be very exciting. It can also have a kind of a slight autoerotic feeling because everything's going round and round and nothing's actually released.
Yeah.
And that is not the kind of, the texture of the movement of political revolution. But yet it somehow appeals to artists. And I'm wondering if its application for art is somehow more powerful than its application for political transformation. There's kind of something in that which is quite distinct, but also might kind of rescue it. In other words, it's a kind of useful creative theory rather than a political theory.
Yeah, this is a good reflection. I think that maybe when Lacanian theory came into politics, it is in a simplified way, not in the whole complex manner and so on. And maybe when connected to art, is more in his complex, and I mean, I know different artists from different places living today that came, that has tattoos with his Lacanian diagrams and so on, and they are always reading Lacanian in his complex theory. But maybe when jumping into politics, the uses of Lacanianism are more simplified to concrete concepts or ideas. For example, in Spain, I think this idea of hegemony and this idea of the floating signifier were relevant to articulate a new discourse on what the left-wing parties has to do to convince the votants, because the debate was not about the real things but about the words they used it's not about the content of the word, it is about the word. And if you say Spain has a concrete significance and specific significance, and if you can change the meaning of the word Spain, because Spain is only a word, and you can adapt this significant Spain to different and plurinational perspective to englobe Catalonia and Galicia and so on. But this is a very simplified use of Lacan. But it is Lacan. I mean, without Lacan, there is not this use and these strategies and these reflections on the uses of the words and the symbols and so on will not be exist. So I think, and I don't know if I'm answering your question because I'm making a reflection that is a bit, but I think that in the artistic way, Lacanian could be more dense, could be more profound, and could be more really connect with the complex ideas of Lacanianism in his reflection about identity and the unconscious and the self and the je, the moi and so on. And in political theory, it is a abbreviated Lacanian theory, but it is also Lacanian theory, and it is also, I think, useful. And in relation with the South American Revolution, I don't know anything, so I don't know if I can say something.
But I think it depends on how you define politics and the political realm. I think the whole point of all of this is how it provides kind of a grammar, a syntax, and a language for talking about the subjective, the intimate, in ways that can be politicized and therefore brought as part of collective political movements. Your quote by Spalio, who was someone very important for the LGTB, and we're talking about after the transition movement. in this, in this quote where he says, "It's AIDS that has given me the ability to become." And it's really, I mean, he has a grammar to talk about how he's come out of the closet and how being ill allows. That is having. I see him saying, "I didn't have a language to say this. It's not already there, but I didn't know how." Or it's more complex than simply. So I think that's political as well.
It is, yeah, but there's also, I guess there's a kind of translation there too, because I'm not sure we can say that Lacan or psychoanalysis depathologized homosexuality, but it did create, it sort of talked about a perversion in a different sense. And so there are kind of these there's a taking on, I guess, that happens, that the politics becomes translated through interpretation or through creative practice or whatever it might be. It's a different sort of movement, I guess, than what we might think of kind of as, the top-down kind of political transformation, which is, I think really interesting.
Yeah.
Just very quickly, I was struck by, you mentioned Espaliu again, the title of that article, Retrato de un artista desahuciado, and Villadoc, sorry to come back to him, but uses that term desnonat and desnonamen, which is the Catalan equivalent, precisely of that. So it just struck me. Sorry, I'm just very excited.
Amanda.
Yes, speaking of the language and the self, I was wondering, I have no idea what was going on in the literary realm in Spain during that time, but obviously Lacan has influenced a lot the way people in France spoke about the self and the memoir, the autofiction, etc. And I was wondering if there is any way of finding Lacan in the literature, like memoirs or in general, the way he changed fiction, the way that the idea of the self that is more elliptical and fragmentary was reflected in popular and literary fiction in Spain.
Yeah, I'm not a specialist in literature because I was always between art history and philosophy and so on, but I think that, for example, the interest, and I mentioned in Severo Sarduy, who was the partner of François Val, who was the editor of Lacan, and I think in Severo Sarduy there are things that can be related to Lacan. And Severo Sarduy was not Spanish, but I think that in that time was in some of the circles related to these Lacanians a very relevant figure, and I think that there are a style and an approach that can be connected with Sarduy's type of writings. And I think that other example that could be interesting is Biel Mesquida, the poet, that was one of the main queer poets at that time, and his approach to the sexuality and the identity and so on are also very traversed by Lacanian psychoanalysis, and of course there will be a lot of examples. And I think that the texts by Biel Mesquida are very autobiographical in the sense that he's speaking about his own experience, so they are very powerful. And I don't know, there's a lot of, but I'm not a specialist in literature, maybe people like, as you said, Guillaume Villadot and so on, and it's a complete transformation of the ways of speaking.
He gives Lacanian titles to his articles, to his poems, sometimes to his. He's got a series of sculpture. You've got one. Yeah,
there is a way of talking about the self after dictatorship that is quite interesting to me, because it's reclaiming a space of self-definition and self-expression that I think in Italy, for example, I feel it was particularly strong after fascism, that now we consider quite standard memoirs in a time where the silence is so prominent in the generation that comes out of that extremely traumatic experience. There is often a generation of silence, and then the following generation recovers all the strands. So that's, I think, like the idea of having a memoir is already by itself an incredibly revolutionary act of breaking that silence. So having the grammar to break that silence, I think it's quite.
No, and in difference with in Spain, there is also the coincidence that I find very powerful of the end of the dictatorship, and also the influence of this whole movement through different countries related to the 1968 and sexual liberation and so on. I mean, it is there are two things that are extremely tied, and I think that proposes or presents a complete transformation of the self-reflection and the grammar of and the vocabulary to speak about the self.
Thank you.
Can you say a little bit more about how this fits within your bigger project? Is Lacan one of the thinkers that you're looking at? Or?
Yeah, I'm still reflecting on how to do it, how to approach this whole thing. I started this project. The first thing I wrote about this was related to the translation of discourses by Federico Jiménez dos Santos, the edition, because I was researching about Jean-François Lyotard, and then I found that the first book well edited in Spain by Lyotard was made by Federico Jiménez dos Santos, that today is an extreme right journalist, and I was deeply impressed by that fact, and then I started to research what happened in that time, and then I discovered that he was at that time a Maoist, but he translated Lyotard, that was not a Maoist, but any of were a right-wing nothing. So this is the point of the part for me as a personal experience of research. I start with Lyotard, discovering what happened with Lyotard and why it was translated and what happened in this field and all these artistic theories. And then I found about the Deleuze and Guattari's reception in Madrid by the Schizos of Madrid, and then I found about Jacques Lacan and his impact in his literary theory, and then I found about Roland Barthes, and there is a constellation of names that traverse different disciplines, because there are artists that were influenced by these theoreticians, but there were also writers and poets, but there were also sociologists, but there were also psychiatrists. The people that make research on psychiatry is only in psychiatry, so they know the reception of Lacan maybe, but they don't know nothing about Lyotard or Deleuze, and the people who are in art history doesn't know anything about these things that are happening in the world of psychiatry. So I think my project, one of the points of my project is to connect all these separate fields, trying to produce a narrative that is transversal to different specific disciplines. Something that is like, I don't know, but maybe how this vocabulary, this grammar came into Spain and was used in different fields and different spaces and places for different people.
It's fascinating, thank you. Yeah, and I think that interdisciplinary dimension is it's really fascinating.
Yeah, for me it's also because I studied history of art, but also philosophy, and I'm always between the two, and I am my PhD was about Jean-François Lyotard, but in a department of art history, and it was very striking because the art historians are always asking why philosophy, and the philosophers why art, and so I don't know, maybe with now I'm thinking in terms of cultural studies, and I'm happy because it's everything, so there are no limits.
about this idea of accessibility, I think that is crucial to the way he penetrated the cultural world, and I think it's something to, because my field of research is auto theory, and what I'm interested in is how the literary makes the critical theory accessible and hence expands it.
Yeah.
And I think that has got a lot to do with the way the interdisciplinarity plays a role, because the access to a certain type of discourse, I think, might be facilitated by the translation, but also by the incorporation with other subjects and fields. I think is super interesting.
Yeah, and I think that, for example, when I spoke about, I think the main figure who disseminated Lacan in Spain was Oscar Masotta in the 1975, but there was text translated in the 70s, but it is very interesting that maybe these early translations couldn't be understood by anyone because there was no introduction, there was no prologue, there was no dictionary of Lacanian theoretical. So maybe it is necessary a transdisciplinary approach to understand what things. It is not like, oh, in the 1970 there is a text by Lacan. Okay, Lacan is in Spain from the... No, because there is a text, but no one can understand this text, and the text can't be understandable in the 75 when Masotta came and explained the text. Yeah.
That's another question. I mean, when I look back in the period of the 90s and the 2000s, when I was still first studying, and people were really quite high on some of these kind of theorists, these post-structural theorists, including Lacan, Derrida, and Foucault in a different way. And I look back on it on occasions with a certain kind of embarrassment, partly because I think we worked really, really hard and expected them to do so much. That's not to say they weren't influential in lots of ways, but there were also sort of really effortful deployments of that work, and also I think of that work itself. And thinking about this work in the context of kind of political revolutionary contexts, are there any what kind of feelings circulate the ideas that you're discussing, the politics that you're discussing, like including embarrassment or failure or kind of something being inept, because you're kind of plotting a path of that's productive. But I think the paths of any ideas and any politics aren't always productive. There's also embarrassment, failure, shame. We went too far, we thought too much, we hoped too much.
Yeah, this is very interesting. I think that in the context I am studying, it is more always productive than failure, because there were people that need this and that were like every reading could be useful for something, and it is not like an academic context or like something that could happen today, that you read 30 seminars by Lacan and you end the lecture and the reading, and it's like, I don't know what to make with this. But at that time, maybe each little text could be useful. But it is interesting in relation with the general disappointment with. There is a thing that for me is very interesting. That is most. I don't know if mostly of them, but there are a lot of people who were deeply in politics at that time, reading Deleuze and Lacan and Lyotard and so on, that today are connected to right, extreme, fascist theories. And maybe this reaction to change from radical left-wing politics to radical right-wing politics could be part of disappointment with the possibilities related to this new theory. Like reading all these things is useless because we are tied to something that we are not happy with, and maybe the fascism could be more useful for us. if we can reflect on the disappointment of this type of theories in the 70s, it could be through this approach that can lead to right-wing politics.
Yeah, and should also be said that in Spain it is the embarrassment and defeatism that is the mainstream in the way the history that in the period that Sergio is working on has been mostly explained. So the main discourse is about defeat. So in a sense, I think that's also important to put into context. That it is important to see, and perhaps to see how those.
Yeah.
I mean, because Jiménez Los Santos is just one thread that takes you from Maoism to the extreme right, but that's just.
Yeah.
It's not the only thread. There is Español,
yes.
and so there are other ways in which you can think about that. I want to make another comment, which is, I feel uncomfortable with the idea of, the French come to Spain and they give us all the ideas and everything is derivative in Spain. From my modest position, I think it's important to make this more complex, and I really like your detour through Argentina. I think that's key. And you've mentioned exile. Thank you. That's what I work on. But there are many ways in which in France, as we've talked about, Guattari, Foucault, they knew the exiled Spanish psychiatrists and they were very influenced by that. So when these people come to Spain, in a sense, they have other influences that are not only French. And then there is the production of new things. The production of new things in Argentina. Psychoanalysis is very important. It's very political in Argentina through politicization. I mean, people who were in the avant-garde of politics, they would say, "Oh, wait here! I'm going to go and do my psychoanalysis." People, there is a connection. And the Masotta is a political exile. So there must be something in the way he talks about Lacan that has gone through the Southern Cone and spoken Spanish and changed. And then brought to Spain. I think that's those ways that ideas of traveling and going through margins and coming back to the center. I think that's very interesting to think through, but very closely.
Yeah, sure. I agree completely with you, and I'm trying to do this reflection on also the geography of the theory. Is not something about at that time happened this thing, but from when it come and why and how and so on. And I think that the most relevant thing is not the origin, because there is no origin, because each translation is a re-elaboration and each context is a re-elaboration of the theory, and it is for that I said that it is not Lacan, and also there is not Masotta. There is each people that re-elaborate the theory for his own interests and purpose. But there is also a fact that I didn't say because it was too longer and I was yesterday cutting parts of the whole paper. But there is one thing that we discussed last week. There is that before the existence of alternative psychiatry alternative, I don't know now the name of the network that was led by Guattari and so on from the 77 till I don't remember the year. Before that, there was another group that was founded in Spain that it was named something about the map of the vergüenza, of the shame, the map of the shame, that was integrated by Franco Basaglia, but also Ramon Garcia, the Spanish anti-psychiatrist, and was also Guattari, and was also Foucault, but only in one meeting. He came only once, and it's like, oh, Foucault is coming with us to one meeting to explain his theories. But it was this group about the map of the shame was made and exists before alternative to psychiatry. And this group was founded by Spanish people connected with Italian people, the Franco-Basaglia's people, and were not led by the French. Yeah, there was Guattari and there was, for example, Robert Castel, but it was as a part of a more democratic thing with 12 people working from different countries and with reunions and meetings in Barcelona and Lisbon also. And then in the 77 is when starts the group Alternative to Psychiatry, and that is French-centered and led by Félix Guattari and so on. So there are also some events and some groups and some places that can be introduced in this narrative to create a more complex and polymorphous structure that thinks us to reflect in a different way about this, all these things in a more decentralized way without mention always the same French theories that are relevant, but this is something that I am working on, and today it was about Lacan because it's
That's good. Any other comments?
I had a question about that theological review. You mentioned the uses of Lacan for the LGBT community, which surprised me because precisely had been criticized by feminists before. And then I suppose, so if you could tell a bit more about that, and then I suppose I had a more general question about perhaps reflecting your title, Lacanianism, as a sort of, is that something, a unified system, or is that on the contrary something that is capacious enough to, from what you say, I have the impression that it points towards something more capacious and free. But I can't help myself asking the question as to, for me there's a bit of a contradiction between the transition towards democracy and the figure of Lacan himself, who was extremely dogmatic in his practice, and the Jacques Lacan, etc. And the way he organized his sessions, and also the general kind of flippancy that he had about, when people didn't understand him, he didn't want to grant him an explanation that was understandable. It was sort of, I don't understand what I say myself, and this kind of ground position. So I just wanted to know whether you had what your position was on that, on Lacan and his own practice, which, at least for me, I mean, it strikes me as perhaps not the most democratic.
Yeah, of course. About Lacan and feminism, and it is very interesting, but most of the feminist theoreticians of that time, as Julia Kristeva, Lucie de Garay, or Hélène Cicieux, were also were working with Lacanian vocabulary and grammar. So I think that part of the critiques that were made from feminist theorists and theoreticians to Lacan are sometimes made using their own Lacan's vocabulary. So I think there is a work of the appropriation of Lacan's vocabulary and to a sort of détournement of the works, of the ideas, of the concepts, of the grammar used by Lacan from feminist theoreticians. So there was at that time in the Spanish transition, for example, there was very relevant because I read the transcription of some of the seminars by Masotta, especially the seminars that Masotta gave in Vigo about Lacan, and there was a woman in the public who say, but this is not feminist, and this is a very phallocentric perspective and approach. And Masotta gave her a book written by a feminist theoretician that is named something like Psychoanalysis and Feminism or something like that, that was translated in Spain at that time, and give her the book saying, yes, but you must read also this book written by a feminist theoretician that maybe can help you to understand Lacan's concepts in a different way and useful for the feminist struggle. So this is the first question. And about Lacanianism and about Lacan's own practice as a therapist. I read the biography of Elizabeth Rudinesco about Lacan, and I think Lacan was a bad person and made a lot of things that for me are very complicated and I don't agree with. And I think he was a great theoretician, but I'm not sure if he was a great therapist. Because his therapies lasted in his last times only 10 minutes or 5 minutes, so he has a fila, a line of people waiting, and it's like the following, yes, and it's only 5 minutes with Lacan. So I think in Lacanian therapy and psychoanalysis is like always in life. If you find a good therapist, it will be different if he's a Lacanian or he's a Freudian, or if he's a conductivist, or I mean, it depends on the empathy of the person. And I think that Lacan was not a very empathic person, but he was a great philosopher, a great theoretician, and I think that part of his transformation and transverse from psychiatry and pure psychiatry to psychoanalysis was because in psychoanalysis he can develop and he can explore more abstract and philosophical questions that were at that time part of his debates with Hippolyte and Kojève and all his friends of that time, Bataille. So I mean, I think that one thing is the Lacanian therapy, and another different thing is the useful of Lacanian concepts for political ontology or ethics or whatever. And about Lacanism in general and the possibility of, it's clear that there is not one Lacanianism, it's not one Freudianism, and it's not one Deleuzianism. It's each person and each approach that can change the whole. But it's true that at this time, and maybe today it is still like that, there is it's like the Lacanianism is more closed than other different lines of thought. So maybe there's not one Lacanianism, but it's more homogeneous, the Lacanianism, than the Deleuzianism or the I don't know, Heideggerianism. I don't know.
We're going to leave it here because we've run past our time. Thank you very, very much. Sergio, I think that was very productive and we had a good conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.